Adaptation choice. Option A. Dad refers to a patriarchal board member who publicly humiliates Bernard. The secret purchase is a modest single share Bernard bought in the company. She was in the middle of a sentence when the room stopped being a room. Glass walls refracted the morning light into clean slices. A projector painted graphs the color of money across the polished table. Alexandra Ashcroft's voice threaded between bullet points, steady as the empire she'd built. The board leaned in, suits like a semicircle of quiet judgment. Outside, the city roared on. Inside, the world narrowed to her and the numbers that named it. Then, her breath skittered. It was a sound that didn't belong in a room of power. A small, involuntary gasp, a throat emptying on itself. Her hand slipped from the remote. Her face, at once composed and suddenly hunted, moved toward the speaker. Someone laughed, then stopped mid-laugh. The sound folded into the small, hot panic that filled the space. Bernard had the mop in one hand and the bucket in the other. He'd come in late, the way janitors drift through meetings that belong to other people. Silent, expected, a minor manual punctuation to the day. He saw the woman go still. He saw the table clear 2 breaths later, in that peculiar way rich rooms do, people simultaneously compassionate and terrified, unsure how far they could reach. He didn't think. He moved. His hands knew the motions because of a night class at the community center, because of a banner that said, "Learn to save a life," and a teacher who'd said in a voice that meant it, "You never know when you'll be the one." He'd paid $10 from his paycheck for that class, and 3 more for the certificate, the ink on cardstock still soft in a drawer at home. He put the mop against a chair. He put his hands where the teacher had told him to, and he pressed. In the boardroom, those compressions sounded like a percussion line, firm and mechanical. Breaths came back into Alexandra in little staggered pieces, air being coaxed, not gifted. Someone shouted for an ambulance. Someone else fumbled with a phone. For a moment, the room belonged to the mechanics of care and to the small, intimate violence of compressions. Bernard felt the thump of the table under his palms. He counted in his head the rhythm they drilled into him. 100 a minute, minimum. He counted until he lost count. When the paramedics took over, they took the woman and the story too. A pair of hands in black gloves wrapped around Alexandra with a care that was both professional and perfunctory. The chair was pushed back into place. The projector kept humming, catching dust motes in its cone. Bernard sat back on his heels for 1 second, as if to gather himself, and then a hand was on his shoulder, hard, public, the kind of hand that reminds you where you stand. "Sir," Marcus from security said, voice flat, "you'll need to step out."
It was the phrasing of a bureaucracy putting a human being into the wrong box. There was gratitude in some people's eyes, then a sudden, nervous decision to make the scene tidy. Edmund Price, a man whose hair was all silver and whose voice had the warm authority of a father in a boardroom, cleared his throat and leaned forward. The old men liked to call themselves the company's parents. Edmund liked to call Bernard son when he wanted the room to feel orderly. "You can't do that here," Edmund said, and the words were small but decisive. "Not like that." Bernard opened his mouth. He had no prepared speech for the moment after he'd pulled a breathing person back from the edge. He had a single sentence he always came back to in his fatherly ways. "I did what I had to do." Instead, the room offered him a legal phrase about policy. Tyler Brigham, the CFO, thin and very efficient, cleared his throat. "This is an HR matter," Tyler said. "We have to maintain boundaries." It happened with the quickness of a shutter closing. Fiona from executive support appeared with a tablet, fingers already composing the first note. Inappropriate physical contact. The bureaucratic translation of a life-sustaining touch. Marcus guided Bernard to the door with a hand like an usher's, and someone clicked a photograph as he left. A grainy still of a man pressing on a chest, his face intent, palms flat. That photograph would become a weapon, but in the room it felt like a punctuation. The paramedics wheeled Alexandra out. The board, a scatter of suits and ties, resumed their meeting as if their seats were platform and pulpit. Edmund's hand brushed Tyler's knee beneath the table. "Best to address optics," he said, and the phrase landed like a verdict. Bernard walked back to his mop closet with his shoulders slightly hunched. He smelled bleach and old coffee. Someone's watch chimed. He felt as if the room had cataloged him and put him away with a clean label. Liability. He tucked the memory of the compressions into the same pocket he kept his ticket stubs and his daughter's drawings. He didn't yet know how a good thing could be turned into an accusation. By noon, a terse email pinged on his work-issued phone when he'd stopped by the HR office to ask, politely, if someone had checked on the woman he'd saved. The message was short and sterile. It used words like conduct and investigation and immediate termination. The secretary looked at his hands. "We need a signature," she said. He signed. The ink felt like a verdict, and he thought of the little faces that relied on him. He thought of Molly, who was 6, and who still lined up things in 2 neat rows on her dresser.
One for favorite toys, one for foods she wanted to eat when they had them. He thought of Janet, who lived next door, and had once given him a casserole when their heater sputtered in January. On the street, the city didn't redirect for one good act. The sidewalk kept moving.
He waited at a bus stop because the pay he did have could not be spared for a cab. A man in a suit stood inside the bus shelter and did not look at him. A woman with wireless headphones glared after him, as if distance was cleanliness. Then the screen went viral. Someone in the boardroom had a security feed on their watch. Someone else had an angle that made Bernard's hands look invasive instead of life-saving. Still frames cropped out the paramedics, the signs of true distress. The image that spread was a frozen, ambiguous moment. Bernard's hands over Alexandra's chest, his expression intense, the board in the background like a wall of inert opinion. Captions did the rest. The internet, which thrives on narrative and not nuance, decided quickly what the narrative would be. Messages came first as a trickle, a text from a former neighbor with a link and a question mark. Then the trickle turned to a fist. "Did you see this?" the messages asked, not really asking. A screenshot of the still was forwarded with the kind of breathless certainty that removes context. Comments multiplied, quick accusations, then mocking laughter. People who had never met Bernard felt licensed to pass judgment. A few seconds of him pressing for life became a tableau used to cut him down. Work fell away. The small gigs he picked up to make ends meet dried up. The cafe across the street, where he'd washed dishes in the past, unclipped a notice from the community board. "We have to be cautious with our hires." His number of returned calls shrank. A woman he had hoped for at a temp agency stopped answering his emails. The clerk at the convenience store looked down when he walked in, placed his change on the counter as if covering it with shame. He was a man who had never been seen, and to be seen as a problem is another kind of invisibility. At home, the radiator coughed, and they ate noodles that tasted like the same thing every night. Molly set an extra small cup of tea by an imaginary chair for her stuffed rabbit. Bernard pretended not to notice, because pretending not to notice had become a kind of armor. Janet watched over them the way some neighbors do, practical, saving what she could of dignity for other people's children when life had been stingy with it. She brought over a sweater and a loaf of bread she couldn't afford, and asked if she could pick up Molly from school next week. He accepted because pride was a luxury he could not afford for himself when his child's life was at stake. The smear did not stop at unemployment. It infected his community standing. Old friends stopped returning calls he used to make to say, "How you doing, man?" His landlord, who had been patient for a long time, called with a new patience that wore thin. Bernard's ankle twisted on a stair, the injury hurt in a way that had no juicy story behind it, only an aching inconvenience.
As if the binary explained the complexity of a man leaning over another to keep her alive. A televised commentator parsed the scene and asked with an air of learned concern whether employees of certain stations should be allowed to cross the boundaries of the executives they served. Bernard began to have strange, dream-inflected nights where he felt the boardroom under his feet when he stepped out of the shower, the mop slotted into his hand like a staff. He'd wake gasping, the rhythm of chest compressions still somewhere in the sinews of his hands. He tried to pull himself together. He tried to look for work and for some proof that the world still made sense. Janet's couch became a temporary refuge during the day when his cough worsened. "You need a checkup," she said, pressing a hand to his forehead like it was a thing she could flatten. He nodded and gave small promises and big excuses. Meanwhile, the person most affected by this cascade sat in a hospital room with monitors that drew thin lines across the air. Alexandra's recovery in the first days was private and wrapped in medical privacy. Her handlers moved with the professional care of people who administer damage control as often as they do balm. She sent short, formal notes to the board, thanks to emergency services, under close observation. Cameras clustered at the hospital doors like insects. Reporters orbited the statements. On the third night after the incident, when the city had been reduced to a sugar pot of news cycles, Alexandra could not sleep. She replayed flashes, hands, the tilt of a shoulder, the rush of blood to the place in the brain where decisions and authority live, and she found herself returning to the same clip. The security footage had been rough, the angles unforgiving, but there, compressed into a sequence of frames, was a clarity that the edited stills on the internet had cruelly denied. The whole room had moved as one. The paramedics had been delayed by an elevator jam. A woman from the events team had dropped her phone. The board had been frozen, like a forest watching a storm. Bernard, in that footage, was doing something unequivocal. He was steady. He was small and huge all at once. That footage sat on the tablet like a sleeping thing, waiting to be interrogated. Alexandra could not let it be sleeping. She asked Fiona to pull the high-resolution file. She did not want to watch it because her chest felt like it had been compressed into a ball, but because not watching felt like letting the story be written for her. She wanted the whole frame. Fiona sent it across encrypted email. The lawyer in Alexandra's circle, quiet, efficient, mentioned once the word optics. Tyler mentioned it too, in a voice like a metronome. Edmund told a story about how the company had always held itself to a higher standard. The conversation made a neat circle. It was only when Alexandra watched frame by frame that the neatness teased apart. Between breaths and the mechanical clatter of hearts in the footage, Alexandra paused. For a beat, she forgot about shareholder value, about the way apologies had been drafted and then held back. She watched Bernard's face lean over hers, and she felt a strange private gratitude for the man who had pushed air into her lungs. That gratitude was complex and inconvenient. It came wrapped in a guilt she did not want to own and a clarity that felt like a kind of accusation against the whole room. And then, in the corner of a frame, something curious glinted. A folded piece of paper in Bernard's hand as he rose. Something, not a glove, not an ID card, not a manager's lanyard. A white edge of paper folded twice. Alexandra had watched the footage 3 times before she saw it. The folded edge had been in her peripheral attention, like a moth that refuses to be caught. She froze the frame, enlarged it, zoomed until the pixels protested. She couldn't read it from the boardroom angle, just the hint of printed ink and a logo she'd seen all her life. She called security and asked for the raw feed. "Pull everything," she said. Something that had felt like damage to the company for days suddenly felt like a bruise on her own conscience. 40 floors below, Bernard walked home with the ache of the last week in his bones. His phone was empty of calls. Molly's drawing, an awkward son with a stick-figure family, slid from his pocket as he fumbled for his keys. He scooped it up and smoothed it like a thing that might be made right. Back at the apartment, a coughing fit took him by the sink. He braced his elbows, tasted metal, felt the world tilt into a corridor of shadows. He told himself, as he had told himself for years, that he'd rest tomorrow, that he'd call in the morning. He rinsed his mouth. The receipt in his wallet, the small purchase confirmation, rubbed against the soft skin of the inside fold. He lay down for a minute in the living room. The radiator coughed. Molly's rabbit watched from its makeshift stool. He closed his eyes and thought of the compressions again, not as music, but as a thing his hands remembered like a language. He imagined the boardroom from a different angle, the table replaced with tiles, the men in suits with faces that could be kind if someone taught them how. He pictured a future that wasn't just about survival, repetitive, ordinary, but honest. At the hospital, Alexandra's assistant sent a message down a line of security she'd seldom had the reason to use. The raw files came back with a note. "We've preserved footage per your request. There's a segment at 9:12 that shows an object of interest." Alexandra clicked. The image resolved slowly like a photograph developing under warm light. The folded paper rendered into legible ink, a confirmation in the corner that whatever had been bought bore the company's name. For a heartbeat, she felt the world tilt. The man they dismissed as a problem had proof of belief.
He owned, modestly, almost laughably, the slightest piece of the company. 1 share. A trifle in the accounts ledger. But in its smallness, it was a hard thing. It was proof that he had not been indifferent. It was proof that, despite everything they'd done to him, he had kept faith. Her hands trembled, and she felt the tremor in her chest like a small, bright alarm. The image sat on the screen between 2 worlds, the one where he had been shoved out in shame, in the one where a quiet man had quietly voted in his own voice. She saw, in a flash, Edmund's comfortable smile, Tyler's clipped sentences, Fiona's efficient notations. She saw how easily a grateful act had been turned into a scandal because the men at the table preferred order to gratitude. She called Marcus and told him to trace the leak. She called a private line and asked for Bernard's address, which she had seen on a pasted badge in the footage earlier. The security man obliged with the quiet of someone who has always known how to make the instruments of power move. Somewhere in the city, a neighbor left a casserole on Bernard's stoop like an offering. The radiator coughed. Molly drew suns in purple crayon. No one yet had come to make it right. The image on Alexandra's tablet glowed, a small, unblinking ember. She did not yet know what she would do with it, the public statement or the private restitution. She only knew that the image had shifted something in her chest. It had made her question the neat phrase, optics. It had made her feel, as the phone vibrated in her hand, that she now had the whole picture. She exhaled. The boardroom's tidy moral calculus had been undermined not by outrage or by pressure, but by a quiet, stubborn fact. Bernard had believed. That belief, in the raw view, took on a weight she could not dismiss without feeling dishonest. She picked up the phone to call someone higher than HR, someone who would understand the cost of a reputation and the weight of action. Her voice was small when she said, "Find him." When Bernard's cough turned into something worse later that night, when the chill of fever pushed through his bones, and he leaned against the counter and thought for a moment he might not make it downstairs to where Molly slept, no one yet had arrived.
The city hummed with its own indifference. He reached for his phone and held it like a thing that might conjure help. His fingers brushed the folded paper in his wallet, and he thought, foolishly and loudly in the empty room, of the tiny vote he had bought. Across town, a woman who had never been in his life except as the subject of his labor watched the pixels that held his small faith. She thought of nouns like responsibility and restitution in a new syntax. She wasn't ready to absolve herself. She wasn't ready to believe that everything would be easy, but she could not unsee the evidence that a man whom they'd labeled invisible had, in a small way, made himself visible to the company he served.
The door to Bernard's apartment creaked. He heard a knock that sounded like the beginning of something neither he nor the woman upstairs had yet planned for. He wiped his mouth and set his chin. He tried to stand and the world pitched. The knock came again, more insistent. He took a breath and opened the door. The hallway light threw them both into a narrow plane of shadow and lamplight. There stood a woman with no announcement except the tautness to her jaw and a badge he barely recognized as a thing people with power carry. For a moment she simply looked at him, and in her eyes there was the recognition of a thing she'd seen on a screen and had refused to let go of. "I saw the footage," she said. No press release, no prepared statement, just the fact, spoken in a voice that scribbled an imperative into the small, cluttered life at his feet. Bernard's mouth opened. He tried to answer, but the cough stopped the sound. The paper in his wallet felt like the weight of a coin in a well. The room narrowed to that exchange, the man who had been shoved away, and the woman whose company had dismissed him. Outside, the city kept its slow, indifferent breathing. Inside, a moment of reckoning spotlighted itself as if lit by a hand. He did not yet know that the tiny share he had bought, the laughable, stubborn proof of belonging, would be the hinge on which the entire story would swing. He only knew, for the moment, that the woman at his door looked like she had something to fix. He took a breath, and for the first time in weeks it wasn't only for survival. He straightened, the world pitching but steadying, because someone had come who had the power to listen. If you want the full story and to see how he wins, subscribe. The hallway smelled of old paint and the faint sweetness of too quick coffee. The woman at the door, Alexandra Ashcroft, stood framed in the rectangle of light, a shape that had only ever meant announcements and decisions. Up close, her suit narrowed into a private restraint. Her hands, which signed futures on glossy paper, looked smaller than the world assumed. She did not stand there with speeches. She moved with the blunt, practical urgency of someone who had watched a life hinge in pixels. She knelt before Molly's rug, glanced at the stick figure family pinned over the kitchenette, and then, without breaking eye contact, said plainly, "Who do I need to call?" Bernard tried to answer. The cough split him into small pieces, and every breath was a ration. He found his voice in the place he'd always kept it, a low, steady thing meant for Molly. "You shouldn't be here," he managed. "You can go." "You don't get to tell me that," Alexandra said. Her voice was softer than the one that read shareholder letters. "Tell me what's wrong." She called the ambulance with a speed that cut through protocol. While she waited, she touched the folded paper that sat in Bernard's wallet, his tiny proof of faith, like one might touch a relic.
Fiona hovered at her elbow, offering names of clinics and phrases about confidentiality. Tyler called twice and left messages that smelled of stock prices and deflection. Edmund sent condolences, phrased like an email with a ribbon. The EMTs arrived with the blunt kindness of people trained to make rooms safer. They tested him, murmured to each other, slid him onto a stretcher. Bernard watched Molly from across the threshold. She sat at the table with her rabbit's ears bent at an angle that made them look like a crown. He mouthed something to her, the same sentence he'd said all his life when crisis came. "I'm fine. I'll be fine." But his body did not listen to the words. At the private hospital Alexandra directed them to, lights moved differently. There was an efficiency there that smelled like new sheets and the soft antiseptic of a space that promises repair. She refused an isolated press protocol. "Not yet," she told Fiona, and the single word was more than a decision. It was a space of grace, brief and precarious. In the emergency triage, a doctor slid an oximeter on his finger and frowned at numbers that stretched thin. The diagnosis was careful and human, a severe respiratory infection compounded by exhaustion and dehydration. He needed fluids, oxygen support, observation. Nothing cinematic,
a slow unspooling of a body running short on the resources it needed to keep going. Alexandra sat in the waiting room and watched the soft map of the city's glass towers outside the floor-to-ceiling window. The city had 1,000,000 windows like this one. Each contained a different kind of calamity and different kinds of care. She felt, like an obscenely expensive pressure gauge, the difference between what money could move and what she herself had neglected to move. When Bernard was stable, a nurse escorted Alexandra to the curtained room. He lay small beneath the blanket, his hair sprawled like a dark island. His skin had that sallow thing fever brings. He blinked at her, as if asking whether he should still trust his eyes. "I watched the footage," Alexandra said without preamble. Her voice had the tremor of someone unaccustomed to untidy truths. Bernard's reply was a fraction of a shrug. "People don't know the rest of the story." "No, they don't." She placed a folder on the bedside table. She'd brought the high-resolution feed, the unedited angles, and beside them, printed in a corner, the evidence of the single share he had bought. Confirmation email, transaction number, the company's logo. The paper seemed ridiculous and heroic at once. He turned his head to look. "You saw that?" He smiled in a way that was half ironed and half astonished. "I didn't want anyone to know, not that it would mean anything." "It means something to me," Alexandra said. "And it means something to the people who will see it now." He looked at her then, properly. There was, beneath the disuse of pride, a careful reserve.
"I don't take handouts. This isn't a handout," she said. "It's an acknowledgement. We failed you in the moment you needed being seen. We will start to fix that." He wanted to refuse the grand gestures. Pride had been a small survival tool. "It's not about charity," he said. "It's about being treated like a person." She heard him. Yes. The weeks that followed were an odd choreography, medical regimens and corporate memos, quiet apologies and louder plans. Alexandra moved with a rare impatience. She convened meetings that were not about share prices, but about policies that touched hands and lungs and sleep. Fiona became the linchpin between her conscience and the company's mechanisms. She arranged temporary housing for Bernard and Molly in a modest flat near the school they had wanted Molly to attend, set up a fund for his medical bills, and nudged legal to prepare a public clarification. Tyler objected at every turn. He watched the news cycle like a man guarding a riverbank, counting every pebble that might decide the flow. "We have to manage messaging," he said, which is to say he had to manage what the market would think when a billionaire CEO made a personal restitution. He pushed back on the release of footage, on the immediacy of an apology, on the idea that the company might be seen to admit culpability. Optics, he called it in a meeting, and the word fell, as it often did, like a verdict from a court that only considered mirrors and not the people behind them. Alexandra pushed back harder. She had watched a frame that would not leave her, Bernard's hands, small and sure. She did not want to be the leader who corrected a single injustice with an Instagram apology. She wanted the structure of the company, the contracts and clauses, the wellness budgets, the staff coverage, to change in a way that made the next rescue less likely to become a scandal. When the company issued its statement, it was careful and human. Fiona insisted on strict language, a clear apology, an admission that policies had been applied in error, and an offer to cover medical expenses and to reinstate his employment, though not back to the same old title. The notarized letter that Alexandra signed and had placed on the table before Bernard read like a small legal benediction. She read it aloud to him, an apology, a renunciation of the smear, and a promise to examine internal procedures for protecting employees who act to save lives. The statement did not erase the past. The comment threads outside the announcement were raw and messy. There were those who believed and those who still wanted the simpler narrative of an incident that fit into pre-existing biases. But the high-resolution footage, made public with the hospital's consent and with Bernard's permission, began to change perception in small, stubborn increments. Some faces in the boardroom flushed. Edmund, who had earlier used the soft paternalism of son, felt the air shift under him.
Tyler, whose stewardship of public risk had always been his religion, did not like the sermon. In private, he tried to frame the episode as a lesson in internal controls rather than moral failure. He spoke of clearance and employee boundaries, as if those phrases could absorb regret. Alexandra moved beyond private recompense. She offered Bernard a different kind of position, one he had never sought and felt unqualified for. It was not a managerial title in the traditional sense. She asked him to be the head of a new office, employee well-being and incident response, a program designed to protect workers and give them a voice inside a company that had too often been an echo chamber. "I don't know the language for that," Bernard told her. He meant by that he didn't know the glossy jargon. He meant also that he didn't know how to be visible without feeling exposed. "You'll learn," she said, "and we'll learn from you." He accepted with caveats. The job would involve pain, recounting things, listening to others, seeing how the machine worked from the inside. It would also be a place to shape policy. More practically, it offered stable income and benefits that could actually pay bills and buy medicines when fever rose. He thought of Molly's rabbit and of Janet's casseroles, and of the nights where sleep had collapsed into a long, thin worry. He took the offer because stubbornness can be a kind of hope. Not everyone applauded. The internal backlash was surly and subtle. On social media, a smear resurfaced, a manipulated clip presented as a new angle that omitted the paramedics and made Bernard's hand seem invasive. It arrived like a cold wave, a carefully edited loop, a caption designed to provoke, and an anonymous account that had built its following on outrage. Tyler recognized the narrative muscle of a renewed scandal and tried to use it as a cudgel. He argued for silence while the media thinned. He suggested that they limit the discussion to legal statements and let the matter cool. But the company had already pivoted into a different alignment. Alexandra, having watched a life hang on compressed air, would not let silence be the balm of convenience. Fiona traced the leak's digital thread and found the account's origin, an ex-PR consultant with ties to a rival outlet and a bitter, petty way of seeking clicks. The consultant had edited frames from the original footage to create ambiguity. The company assembled the unredacted files, the timestamps, and the chain of custody. They published a comprehensive account of what had happened, accompanied by first-person testimony from 2 paramedics who had been delayed because an elevator jam had held them back. The publication did more than clarify. It shifted the narrative force. People who had reacted to a single frozen frame began to discover the slow human facts behind it. Commenters who'd been quick to judge posted apologies.
A small but significant number of voices, advocacy groups, worker unions, and ordinary people who had been watching, demanded a formal inquiry into how the company treated incident responses and how it balanced optics with humanity. Under public pressure, and under Alexandra's insistence, the board convened a special meeting where the high-resolution footage was played for them. There was a hush in the room that felt both corporate and confessional. Edmund's hand trembled when he reached for his glass of water. Tyler's jaw tightened, and then loosened into a politeness that people use when their leverage is slipping. "No more optics," Alexandra said to them then. "We fix the policy. We fix the way we talk about our people. We build an emergency fund. We mandate de-escalation and life-saving training for any events where staff are present. We create a whistleblower channel that's actually secure and backed by company funds." Her list was blunt and practical, measurable steps dressed not in slogans, but in budgets and timelines. She asked Bernard to lead it, not because it would make a good photo op, but because she wanted the perspective of someone who had been on the wrong end of a cultural reflex. Bernard accepted the role with a humility that was not false. He had seen how the smallest life-saving gesture could be edited into scandal. He had also seen how a small fact, one email confirming one share, could open a door. The first weeks were a schooling. Bernard sat in rooms with HR directors and auditors and risk managers and learned their languages, acronyms and flowcharts. He learned to translate them into a grammar of care. He convened listening sessions in the employee cafeteria and stood at podiums in warehouses and on loading docks where the work's smell was oil and sweat and grit. He listened to custodians with sore backs and nursing mothers with stories of being passed over for leave. He heard about the temp who'd been forced to clean up blood at an event and then told not to speak to the press. He heard the driver who had been disciplined for stopping to give a passerby a blanket. He did not romanticize his position. He understood that doing this from inside the company could be a compromise. He also saw the possibility. Policy could move money. Money could change conditions. Tyler leaked an internal memo suggesting budget constraints and suggesting scaling back housing supports. The memo was quickly picked up by an outlet and framed as detachment from reality. He argued the company could not sustain a generous program. He said it with the arithmetic confidence a CFO gets when asked to draw a line between cost and conscience. Alexandra, who had watched a man fight for breath and had seen how a small share had revealed something deeper, authorized the initial funding anyway, not a headline-grabbing sum, but a real pool, emergency assistance, paid recoveries, a training fund, and a small housing pilot.
The pilot would secure a handful of modest apartments, transparent criteria for need, and funds for temporary relocation in cases where employees had been slandered or put at risk after responding to emergencies. To her board, this was a risk. To Bernard's neighbor Janet, it was a lifeline that could be the difference between a child staying in a school district that worked for them or being forced to start all over. For Molly, it meant stability. For Bernard, it meant fewer nights crouched over a rent notice. The launch day for the welfare program was not a spectacle in the way the company usually staged things. There were no banners with triumphant fonts. The room was modest.
Bernard stood at a borrowed podium and felt the tremor of the moment. He spoke in a voice that had been honed by compressions and coughs and neighborly casseroles. "I did what anyone would do," he said, and it was both defense and a truth. "I had a little piece of this place, and I kept it, not because I thought I would be rewarded, but because I wanted to belong. This program isn't about pity. It's about making sure somebody's small act of courage doesn't end in shame." The applause was a relief, the way rain can be after a drought. Employees stood and clapped with the nervous generosity of those who had been unseen for years and now had a person at the center speaking for them. Molly, in the front row, chewed her lip and then ran up to hug him when he stepped down. The image circled in the day's feeds: the small child, a rabbit clutched to one side, the man she'd been afraid of losing, lifting her as if she were still the small person who colored suns up a kitchen table. Tyler watched the broadcast on a tablet and felt the ground shifting. He had tried to manage the narrative. He had tried to bend the story to safety. Now the story was moving on him, and policy winds were shifting in directions he had not budgeted for. Resistance did not die. There were calls for deeper inquiry. A faction of the investor community groused that the company had turned moral on them at the expense of capital efficiency. There were 2 board members who suggested that this was a costly detour. The public conversation was less interested in zealotry and more in accountability. People wanted transparency about how decisions were made. Policies were drafted into the Registry of Change and then cross-checked against the ledger. The program's oversight committee included not only HR, but also Walton House, a worker advocacy nonprofit, and 2 employee representatives picked by anonymous ballots. Bernard found himself in rooms where his childhood had never been invited. He was asked to present a budget. He sat opposite Tyler and found their conversations laced with a new kind of respect and a hard, honest friction.
Tyler, who had prided himself on numbers, found that the numbers Bernard presented were not anecdotes, but projections: decreased turnover, fewer emergency liabilities, a better public reputation. He could argue philosophy. He could not argue arithmetic that matched human costs. Outside the company, the conversation broadened. Community groups used the program as a case study. Other companies watched, some with curiosity, others with the immediate arithmetical instinct to copy what reduced legal risk. Unions and advocacy groups held panels. There was a particular moment on public radio where a caller who had been fired years earlier for reporting unsafe conditions spoke of finally being heard because of the changes Alexandra's company had begun. The smear resurfaced once more, this time in a late-night show where a pundit suggested that the company's apology had been overperforming in virtue. The line gained traction among the usual skeptics. A wave of commentators questioned whether a janitor should be the focus of a billion-dollar company's reform. The implication was that moral theater had taken precedence over market stability. Bernard had a choice in that moment that many people face: to shrink away from the stage or to stand in the uncomfortable light. He chose to speak again, not for himself, but for the voices he had been summoned to lift. He spoke at a town hall streamed by dozens of outlets, and he brought forward stories from the listening sessions. An overnight security worker whose medical emergency had been met with suspicion, a temp who had been re-victimized when they reported harassment. He read them plainly and without theatricality. He asked for what seemed simple: paid sick leave, a stronger emergency fund, guaranteed medical coverage for work-related incidents, training that encouraged intervention rather than punishment. The backlash softened when the data matched the compassion. In the first quarter after the program's pilot, absenteeism fell. Retention rose among lower wage roles. The company reported fewer contentious HR actions for resuscitations and interventions. It was not a miracle. It was a sequence of practical choices, funded by a company that had finally decided that neglect carried a cost. Tyler, by then, felt the diminishing of his influence. He did not leave in disgrace. Departure would have fit into a melodramatic telling, but he was quietly reassigned to an external advisory role, where his spreadsheets could exist without the daily friction of human faces. The board announced the realignment with neutral language. No one marched with torches. Instead, the office gossip leaned toward the satisfaction of a problem resolved through bureaucracy rather than spectacle. Bernard's role expanded beyond policy. He started a small stipend-backed community CPR and safety training program that paid employees to learn life-saving skills. He visited school classes to teach kids what to do in emergencies.
He sat with janitors and dishwasher staff and drivers and listened to them tell their fears. He framed the program not as charity, but as mutual resilience. A workforce that could protect itself strengthened the company. A company that sheltered its workers strengthened the community. There were tender days. One morning, a young custodian who had been ostracized for helping a manager after a fall leaned over Bernard's desk with shaking hands and said, "Thank you for making it not feel like it was my fault." Bernard thought of the mop room and of the quiet jokes he shared with a neighbor. His shoulders loosened. Molly watched this new life like a child watching the sky to see if weather could be trusted. She learned to measure stability in smaller things: a weekly grocery run without panic, a library card stamped, a piano lesson that didn't have to be canceled because money was short. She learned, slowly, that the world was not implacable. There was one public moment they had not planned for, a keynote at a small civic forum where Bernard had been asked to present the company's model to other local businesses. He stepped up and told his story simply, without embellishment. He kept the boardroom rescue in the frame, but moved the focus toward the people he had met along the way: the drivers, the temps, the mothers who worked evenings. "This work is about being seen," he said, "not as a problem to be managed, not as a liability, as a person who matters." In the front row, Alexandra sat, her hands clasped. She did not stand up to applaud first. She let the crowd begin and then joined in with a hand that was steadier now because she had aligned action with sight. After the forum, Bernard and Alexandra walked to the curb under the diner lights and talked without an audience. He told her about Molly's drawing pinched under a magnet on his fridge. He told her about his mother who had taught him that one must do what was right even when no one watched. Alexandra listened with the peculiar humility of someone learning how to unlearn indifference. "You didn't have to come to our door," Bernard said at one point. "I didn't have to," she agreed, "but I did." He laughed then, a small sound that had no triumph in it and no pretense. "I still can't believe I bought that one share," he admitted. "It felt like such a ridiculous thing." "It wasn't ridiculous," Alexandra said. "It was a claim. It was saying, 'I belong.' You were making yourself seen in the only way you could." That phrase, "making yourself seen," settled between them like a domesticated bird. It had weight and warmth. The final obstacle came months later, when a group outside the company tried to dredge up the smear for another splash. An anonymous blog republished an old still, cropped to suggest intent, and encouraged readers to demand better. The cycle was not a new one. It was the internet's peculiar inclination to prefer friction to fact. Alexandra made a choice that surprised Size.
She declined the easy route of a defensive release. Instead, she organized an open town hall conversation, streamed publicly, where Bernard, Fiona, 3 paramedics, and a handful of employees answered questions live. Cameras were present. Journalists asked hard ones. The transparency was risky, but it diffused the sensation of secrecy that rumor needs to fester. Questions came fast and sometimes cruel. How did this happen? Could the company be trusted? Was the program sustainable? Bernard answered what he could, and repeatedly returned to a small, simple truth, that the goal was to protect people who, until then, had been footnotes in the company ledger. The town hall did not make everyone quiet. The blog's headline never quite disappeared, but the live conversation created a countervailing force. It humanized the actors, and it provided an empirical record of intent and action. That record was stronger than the cropped frame. In quiet moments, Bernard received letters, handwritten notes left at the front desk from people who had been helped, emails from employees who had regained pay they'd missed out on, a small handmade card from a woman who'd been rehoused through the pilot program and now worked nights at a clinic. The receipts were not large. They were lives rearranged enough to matter. Tyler's circle of influence had frayed, but not vanished. He still had allies who argued for efficiency above all. There were still meetings where the cost of empathy was measured against something else. The change was not a clean line. It was a process, messy and iterative. But the company had crossed a threshold. It had chosen acknowledgement over plausible deniability. Bernard's public visibility grew in measured ways. He was invited to speak at a few conferences. He accepted with a caution he had learned from watching the way media could twist a moment. Each time he spoke, he thought of Molly waiting at home to hear him on the radio, of Janet's casseroles cooling on kitchen counters, of the man on the bus shelter who had not looked at him. He hoped, in the small ceremonies of his new life, to repair yet more of the invisible. And there were quieter domestic victories.
stable rent paid by a small corporate trust while they navigated a longer-term housing plan, Molly's cough vanishing under a competent pediatrician, a new rabbit with ears perking up on the bedroom floor. He placed the share certificate in a frame on the bookshelf, next to Molly's artwork, a small emblem, no larger than a stamp, that had once seemed a foolish act, and now read as a talisman of stubborn belonging. On a late evening, months from the first compressions in the boardroom, father and daughter stood on a narrow balcony that faced the city. Their apartment was modest. The sofa had one arm slightly frayed. The curtains let in a winter gray light. The radiator hummed like a patient thing.
Molly drew the skyline with a fat marker and then pressed it to the wall with scotch tape, as if marking a new constellation. Bernard wrapped an arm around her. He felt the steady heartbeat of a life rearranged. "Do you remember the night you drew that sun?" he asked. "Yes," Molly answered. She tapped the crinkled paper. "You were coughing." He laughed, a small sound made of gratitude and tiredness. "We got through it." "We got seen," she corrected, proud of the verge she had acquired. "You got seen." He thought of the many kinds of seeing. There was the literal, footage magnified until it could no longer be misread. There was the corporate kind, where a CEO's signature could move money and restructure policy. And there was the smallest kind, the neighbor who brought over bread, the paramedic who went home and told his spouse about the man who saved a life, the teacher who did not ask Molly to explain her family's absence. A soft light from a window across the courtyard glowed like a single witness. Alexandra's car passed below, and then slowed for a moment, as if a hand had checked the speedometer. Somewhere else on that floor, Edmund and a few other board members were rereading policies and feeling the gravity of the past months. Bernard held Molly a little tighter. "We're okay," he said, which was true and not absolute. There would be challenges, there would be critics, and months of work, and the rigidity of older systems to bend. But there was also a ledger of concrete change. Someone had died and someone had acted. The action had been punished and then acknowledged. Restitution had followed. Policy had shifted. He put a hand in his pocket and felt the edge of the framed share certificate there, its weight a reminder of the beginning of this arc. He had bought that small piece because he wanted to be part of a place he cleaned, because he wanted his daughter to feel that belonging was something one could buy back from the world, with a little patience and a little money. He had not imagined the certificate would be the hinge of a public reckoning. He had not imagined that a single private vote would make the company look at its own mirrors. Below, the city moved on. Above, the balcony held its modest human intimacy. Molly leaned her head against his chest and hummed the small tune she had made up that month. Bernard closed his eyes and let himself feel the rare unnodding of fear, like a short, honest exhale. Later that night, a notification arrived on his phone, a message from Alexandra. Simple. "Thank you," it read. And then after a pause, "For helping us see." He folded the phone back into his palm and watched Molly sleep. The life they had was not a safe harbor. It was a platform for continued work. Bernard thought of the program he was building, of people trained, of money set aside for emergencies, of the small apartments that meant a child did not have to change schools.
He thought of the more intangible shifts, the way a CEO could stand at someone's door, the way a boardroom could be made to face a person not merely as a line item. There were interviews and articles, and a slow accruing of change across sectors. Other companies reached out, tentative, asking how to set up funds and how to write policies that recognized rescuers instead of punishing them. It was not perfect imitation. The country did not pivot overnight. But one thing multiplied: the conversation about dignity in work, about what it means to belong to the companies whose lights glitter against working-class windows. On a quiet morning, hand in Molly's, Bernard walked past the building where he'd once mopped between meetings. The doorman nodded, an ordinary, human recognition, and Bernard nodded back. It felt like a small miracle of belonging. Alexandra watched him from a distance now and then, not with the theatrical grandiosity of a redemption story, but with a practical satisfaction akin to fixing a leaky pipe. This part was done, and the house would no longer rot in that corner. She continued to steward the policies she had authorized, knowing instinctively that systems could be undone as easily as they were built. She returned occasionally to the little framed share certificate on Bernard's shelf. It was a small token of stubborn faith. It had not made anyone rich.
It had made a man visible. At the very end, there was no grand parade. Bernard did not become a symbol in the hollow sense. He became a leader with calloused hands and a soft laugh, and a child who could sleep without counting pennies. The company did not transform into a utopia. It changed in parts: policy, attitude, a few budgets redirected toward the people who kept its lights clean. Tyler was no longer the loudest voice of the table. Edmund studied the company's guidelines with a chastened attention. Fiona kept the bureaucracy from becoming an excuse. Father and daughter sat once more on that balcony, on an evening full of ordinary stars. Molly drew a sun that was a little rounder this time. The city blurred into a ribbon. "Do you think people will keep being kind?" she asked, casually, as if she were discussing the weather. "I think some will," Bernard answered, "and other people will learn to be. That's how change breathes. Slow, stubborn, and together." She hummed and leaned into him. Bernard folded the world into that small warmth. The framed share certificate, once an almost comical smallness, sat on a shelf in their living room as a quiet testament. A man had voted for his place in the company and for his daughter's future. In the arc between the boardrooms frozen still and the light of a child's drawing, the world had been made a little more honest. If this moved you, like and share, tell someone who deserves to be seen, and check the link for ways to support worker rights initiatives.